Hello and welcome to Michael's Minty Music for today. Today we review the soundtrack for the 2006 game Half-Life 2 Episode 1. It's alright, not bad for sure. This is the track listing, and these are the tracks I added to my playlist, 4 out of 10, so 1 under half here. This album's alright, but it doesn't have a ton of interesting stuff. There are a few tracks here that are pretty good, but most of them are sort of ambient techno tracks that don't really make much of an impression. There's no good flow, as basically every other track slows it down and causes it to drag. The faster combat-oriented tracks are so spread out of around the album that it doesn't really ever get any sort of momentum. The genre is the same sort of techno rock as the Half-Life 2 soundtrack, not much change here. Although I feel like there may be a little bit more reliance on synth in this one. In terms of overall feel, it's definitely in the same vein as the Half-Life 2 soundtrack, but it's just a lot less consistent and recognizable here. The main problem this album faces is that the majority of the songs are really just not much of anything. The songs that are more full are just as good about anything on the main Half-Life 2 soundtrack, but most of this album isn't those songs. So in general, the album's listenable, but you don't really go out of your way to listen to it. Just check out some of the more interesting tracks, and that will get you kind of the gist of it. My favorite track here was definitely 7th track, What Kind of Hospital Is This? It's a super upbeat combat track, and definitely the best track on the album, although the final track, Penultimatum, is also pretty good. So I ranked this album the worst out of all the Half-Life soundtracks, which is appropriate because if I remember correctly, this is probably the worst entry out of the 4 in the main series. Both of the episode soundtracks aren't really better than the first or second game's main soundtracks, based on both quality and quantity perspective. The episode 2 soundtrack ends up being a little bit better than the episode 1 soundtrack, mostly just from having more non-ambient tracks, and thus kind of a better overall flow. It's got kind of a better vibe to it. Additionally, I think episode 2 is slightly more experimental and a little higher quality per song. In terms of overall video game soundtracks, though, it's ranked second from the bottom, only slightly above the Fallen Order soundtrack, as I think Half-Life here is more creative than just sort of the rehashing of all the Star Wars songs that's that soundtrack, so definitely second to last. Also, unsurprisingly, this album doesn't take my top spot from 2006. That goes to Pink's 2006 album, I'm Not Dead, which is definitely better than Half-Life 2 Episode 1 soundtrack. Even if this wasn't, video game soundtrack versus normal, I think I'm Not Dead would still take it. That album's pretty great, and this one's just kind of alright. So. Next up will be Thundercat's second album, 2013's Apocalypse, which goes along to his first album, The Golden Age of Apocalypse. So stay tuned for that, and as always, stay minty.